Good morning and welcome everyone to the 13th meeting of the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee and our fourth remote meeting. We have received apologies today from Gordon Lyndhurst MSP and Kenneth Gibson MSP, and we also have apologies from Ross Greer MSP, and for the committee's meetings in June, Ross will be substituted by Patrick Harvey MSP. Can I ask Patrick Harvey MSP whether you have any interest to declare which are relevant to the remit of the committee? Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. I don't think I have any formally registrable interests, but in the purpose of clarity, I'd like to just put it on the record that I'm, along with a range of other MSPs and politicians from a range of different parties, I'm a voluntary vice president of the European movement in Scotland. I'd just like members to be aware of that.
Thank you very much for that, Patrick. Our main item of business this morning is an evidence session on the fourth future relationship negotiations between the European Union and the UK Government with Philip Rycroft, the former Permanent Secretary at the Department for Exiting the European Union. I'd like to welcome Mr Rycroft to the meeting today, albeit remotely, and can I thank him for giving evidence today on the future relationship negotiations. In a moment, I will invite Mr Rycroft to make an opening statement. Because of the challenges of managing a virtual meeting such as this, we're going to take questions in a pre-arranged order. I would be grateful if questions and answers could be as succinct as possible. And finally, I would remind members to give broadcasting staff a few seconds to operate your microphones before beginning your question or before you start to answer the question. And I would now like to invite Mr Rycroft to make some opening remarks. Mr Rycroft.
Thank you very much, Convener, and very glad to be with you this morning, albeit remotely. Opening remarks really just to say a little bit about my background and perhaps why you're interested in asking me today. So as you mentioned, I worked at the Department for Exiting the EU and UK Government. I worked there from March 2017 through to March 2019. From October 2017 as the Permanent Secretary, the head of that department. I was also, through that time and from the beginning of 2015, the head of the UK Governance Group, which was formed in 2015 from the Constitution Group and the Cabinet Office, Scotland Office, the Wales Office, and the Office of the Advocate General for Scotland. And its job was to provide the main source of advice to the Prime Minister and other ministers on constitution and devolution issues. Just for the record, worth pointing out, I spent the first 20 years of my career working in respectively the Scottish Office, the Scottish Executive and the Scottish Government, and have lived in Scotland, continue to do so for over 30 years. I am now, again for the record, an honorary professor at Edinburgh University, a visiting fellow at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at Cambridge University, specialist partner at Flint Global, and I have some non-exec roles as well. So that's me. Very happy. Look forward to taking your questions on our future relationship with the EU.
Yes, thank you very much, and we're very much looking forward to benefiting from your expertise and your wide-ranging experience today. I think I'd like to start off by talking about the negotiations and the effect of COVID potentially on the negotiations. Michael Gove had said that he thought COVID would concentrate the EU's mind to reach some kind of deal. But last week, David McAllister, MEP, told us that actually COVID was actually slowing down the whole process and making it more difficult to reach a deal. Michael Gove said that the UK government was ready to walk away next month, if no progress had been made, and David McAllister told the committee last week that there was such little progress made that there might not even be a special meeting this month. So that's led to some speculation and suggestions that the UK government is in fact aiming at a no-deal Brexit. And for example, The Spectator, which has quite close channels with the UK government, has argued that the UK government believes that the coronavirus crisis represents an opportunity to walk away from a trade deal, kind of COVID as cover for a no-deal Brexit. What's your view on that?
I personally think that's a very odd view of the world. The exit from the EU, from the transition period without a deal, is a very big step for this country to take. It would have a huge impact on thousands of businesses up and down the land, businesses that are currently struggling, many of them for survival, and to have to face the added complexity and uncertainty of a no-deal exit from the transition period at the end of this year, I think would be very damaging economically. I remain of the view also that a deal is in the interests of both the UK and of the EU. I happen to believe that it is in the interests of the UK government as well. I think it would not be a good look to fail to achieve a deal over the course of this year. But there is an enormous amount of work that still needs to be done in order to achieve that outcome. There's no doubt that coronavirus has slowed things down. It is a huge distraction for the EU and for the UK. From the EU perspective, we tend to get a slightly myopic view of where the EU's interests are. Brexit, even in spite of coronavirus, would be quite a long way down their list of priorities. They are moving on, to coin a phrase, and they want to get Brexit sorted out, but it is not top of their list. So it is up to the UK government, as well as the EU and the Commission leading the negotiations, to putting the hard yards to make sure that we do avoid an outcome of no trade deal at the end of this year.
Right, yes. The UK obviously has not conducted any economic impact assessment in the draft legal text that it produced recently. Obviously, you talked a little bit about the economic impact. You're probably aware that the Scottish Government published a paper yesterday that showed that Scottish GP could be up to 1.1% lower after 2 years, and the cumulative loss of economic activity would be about 3 billion. And obviously there have been other economic impact assessments produced, including by the UN. Given that there's so little time left to conclude any kind of deal, do you think that we are looking at a sort of Yellowhammer situation? And when Charles Grant spoke to our committee some time back, he said that Yellowhammer would still apply.
Yeah, so there's two questions in there. What is the economic impact likely to be? As you're quite right, there's lots of economic impact assessments that have been done, including one led by my department, by the Department for Exit in the EU, which was published in November 2018, which looked at a range of possible scenarios, from no deal through to so-called average FTA, to an EEA type outcome, to the white paper then proposed by Mrs May, then Prime Minister. The outcomes that we're most interested in now, clearly, are the average FTA, because that's what the government essentially is heading for, or possible no deal. And that work suggested that modelled an impact over 15 years, which suggested that the GDP growth in the UK would, under an average FTA, be around 5% lower than it otherwise would have been. Under a no deal, it would have been about 7.5% lower than it otherwise would have been. Just to be absolutely clear with the committee, this is not GDP falling by that amount. That is growth of the country not growing as fast as it otherwise would have done. So that is essentially, it's lost growth. Now, that modelling happens to sit about in the middle of the pack for all of the other modelling that's been done by lots and lots of groups of economists, private sector, public sector, and elsewhere. So we do have a pretty clear understanding of the likely impact, but of course that has not been that hasn't been updated to take account of the government's negotiating position. But I think that that modelling, as I say, remains, to my mind, sound modelling. If we end up with a no trade deal at the end of this year, of course, the withdrawal agreement, the treaty that we have now signed up to as a country that encompasses that, remains in place. So some of the issues that I was worrying about at the beginning of last year in terms of citizens' rights, the budgetary commitments, and particularly the relationship with Northern Ireland, those things would remain in place. But we would be moving into a new trade relationship pretty much overnight, which would take us on to WTO terms and conditions. And that would have a very big impact. And there is clearly a risk in that, because businesses have not had the time, partly because of coronavirus, to prepare sufficiently for that there would be hold-ups at the border because businesses would not have the right paperwork in place. And all of the issues that I worked very hard on with my team when I was in the civil service would kick in again, including possibly the requirement for the civil contingencies planning that came under the Yellowhammer heading. So there is still a risk, depending on what happens at the end of this year, that we would see disruption as systems, traders on both sides of the border adjusted to the new trading reality.
There's lots I would like to follow up with that, but we're restricted to 2 questions because of the virtual session. So I have to set a good example to the other committee members, but hopefully we'll be able to come back at the end, and I'm sure many committee members will want to follow up on some of the things you've said there. Claire Baker.
Thank you, convener. So you have argued this morning that the UK government does not favour a no trade deal Brexit, that they do want to see a resolution to the current situation. The convener mentioned a proposal or the argument that we should have an extension, and I know that is not possible without a legislative move from the UK government and a request from the UK government. But why do you think they're so set against an extension given the current COVID crisis we're all facing? And do you have any views on the proposal there could be a conditional extension? This idea that, let's look back on the papers, but Raul Reperel to our committee has talked about this idea of a conditional extension.
Thank you. Obviously a very, very topical question because we are approaching a hard deadline at the end of this month in terms of the ability of the UK to request, and both sides, if the EU is successful, to agree an extension of the transition period by up to 1 or 2 years. Just again, for the committee's understanding, this is an important deadline because that request for an extension is made under the authority of the Withdrawal Agreement Treaty. That in turn is founded on Article 50 of the treaties, and the authority of Article 50 has now expired. So this is a hard stop. If the UK has not requested that extension by the end of this month, it becomes very, very difficult legally to agree an extension before the end of the transition period at the end of this year. Raul Reperel has put forward an interesting proposition to see whether there was something that was negotiable in that space that would, as you say, be a sort of conditional extension. I think that the lawyers would tell you that is going to be really quite difficult to do because the legal base in European Union terms is simply not there. And there are obviously treaty articles that would allow the EU to negotiate a different treaty with the UK, but those treaty articles generally fall under so-called mixed competence. So this couldn't just be decided by the Council of Ministers on its own. It would require ratification by member state parliaments. For some countries, their constitutions require ratification by regional parliaments. In other words, it's a complicated and time-consuming business. So if the end of this month passes by without a request and agreement on extension of the transition, I personally think it will be very, very difficult to revive that as a proposal. Now, you asked the question, why is the government resisting extension? I look at this not so much from the perspective of the negotiations or the sort of the whole complex set of arguments around Brexit, but simply from a practical point of view, that if we do not extend the transition at the end of this year, deal or no deal, there will be a new trade border with the EU. People need to understand that. Even if we get a free trade agreement, because the terms of trade will change very substantially, that requires a new trade border for both goods and services. And as I've said in response to conveners' questions, that is a huge challenge for UK-based businesses and indeed EU businesses trading into the UK. Just right where we are at the moment, pretty much every business in the UK is dealing with the biggest peacetime economic shock that we've faced since 1929, at a minimum. And the afterburn, if you like, of that shock is going to still be with us through the rest of this year and probably well beyond. So it would appear to be an odd time when you've got a choice to be adding to the burden on businesses. And of course, this would be an asymmetric shock, would impact on UK or more particularly GB businesses more than it would EU businesses, just at a time when businesses will be trying to find their feet again after the coronavirus crisis. So in that context, why is the government apparently insistent that it will not seek an extension? I think you have to look for the answer to that into politics. This is a political decision, and it's a political decision the government has taken, presumably because it believes that reflects the interests of those people who voted in the election and gave it that substantial majority, and it is sticking by the proposition it put to the electorate. It's a perfectly legitimate political decision to take, but of course that political outlook does not necessarily coincide with the interests of a lot of UK businesses.
So you've presented the significant challenges there are in the next 6 months. If there's no request for an extension, the difficulty there will be, the challenges there are in trying to achieve a deal by the end of the year. Do you think it is realistic for the government and the EU to manage to reach consensus by the end of the year? You said the UK government do not want a no trade exit, so that's not what they're planning. They plan to get a deal. That just seems extremely challenging, I have to say. And I think most people agree. We're struggling to find any commentators who would support a position that it's possible, given where we are now, to reach a deal by the end of the year.
I may be a bit of an outlier then. I think it is still possible to reach a deal. I'm not saying it's by any means a slam dunk. There is a huge amount of work still to do. We know pretty much where the big differences are between the two sides. Obviously very pertinent from a Scottish perspective, big issues around fisheries. For all of us, all citizens, all businesses in the UK, issues around level playing field, which the committee will understand well, the rules and standards govern environment, labour markets and fair competition in the business context. Also a bit more arcane, but really important, big differences on the structure of the deal that might be done. If you look at these issues carefully, there is, I have no doubt, scope for compromise. It is possible to see on each of those three issues a way forward, but critically it depends on the political will to make those compromises. And that will have to come from both sides. This is not a one-way street. Both sides have taken quite strong positions on those issues, and both sides are going to have to shift. So if the political will is there, a deal is possible by the end of the year, in my view. How likely is that outcome? I'm not a betting man. If I was asked for odds, however, I wouldn't be putting it much better than 50-50. But I think even on that, I'm probably then ahead of most commentators who are a bit more gloomy than that. But it is just worth remembering that it remains in my view, and I think in the view of most commentators on this, overwhelmingly in the interest both of the EU and of the UK to have this sorted out, so the trading relationship by the end of this year. It is in neither side's interest to have the uncertainty and the confusion of a no trade deal outcome, because don't forget that would spill out into all the other domains of our relationship with the EU, not least security, where the citizens both of the UK and of the EU have grown dependent on very close security cooperation. And needless to say, it would be a good thing if that cooperation was to continue.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Oliver Mundell to ask us questions. Oliver.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for your answers so far. I wondered, you say that there's the red lines and that there would need to be compromise on both sides. Do you think that having any longer for the negotiations is likely to produce movement? My own feeling, and kind of seeing other EU negotiations, seeing the previous negotiations around the withdrawal agreement that you were involved in, is that the EU particularly tends to move at the last minute. So therefore, having a focused deadline might produce results, particularly on things like fisheries, where there's already some sense that they might be willing to move on their original position.
Yeah, it's a fair point. The sort of the dynamic of negotiations, not just obviously around the UK's exit from the EU, but the way that international negotiations tend to run generally. And there is a risk, I've no doubt, that negotiations sort of can expand to fill the time available to them. I think the argument for an extension that I've made, I don't think the government will follow that argument, and it's very clear it probably won't, is around the economics of transition rather than around a negotiating impact. But I think so. The way I see the state of the negotiation where we're at now, and the positions of the two sides, come back to the point: if the political will is there, the time is there to get these issues sorted out. You're quite right that the really tough, controversial issues in any negotiation tend to be the ones that are settled late in the day. So the really important time to watch in this negotiation is going to be September, October. Don't forget, it really needs to be put to bed around about the end of October in order to allow time for ratification, both in the UK and in the EU, before the end of the year. And time pressure can help to get folk over the line. But the key issue here clearly is the willingness of both sides to compromise on their original positions in order to allow a deal to emerge. Just one final point, which again I think is worth emphasising in all of this. We're talking mainly about a trade agreement, a deal being sorted out on that by the end of the year. The UK's relationship with the EU, clearly has been a member for several decades, is a very complex one, and there are a number of different domains which we'll need to sort out to have an ordered and structured relationship with the EU into the future. I see very little possibility of having all of that sorted out by the end of the year. We may get a free trade agreement, but there will be plenty of other domains. I've already mentioned security, but for example, transport and energy, the UK's engagement in EU programmes and so on and so forth, which may not be sorted out on that timescale. So if we do get a deal, I suspect that we'll still be seeing continuing negotiations into next year on different aspects of our future relationship.
Thank you very much. In terms of possible movement, do you think, in your experience, that the willingness is there? And what do you think the kind of final outcome would look like on, for example, fishing? and also on the level playing field? What do you think a compromise would look like?
I can't answer your question on if the political will is there. I mean, that is, we're all reading the rooms on that. As I said, my instinct is to say that for both sides, as we get closer to the end of this process, the sort of dawning realization that failure to get a deal does not look good domestically for the UK government, does not look good for the EU. I think from the EU perspective, they'll just want to get this sorted and be able to move on, get Brexit done out of the way. Though, of course, there will be lots and lots of ongoing negotiations and discussions with the UK from here on forever, because of that relationship is so important. But getting the principles of that relationship sorted out, I think they will see very much in their interest. You ask about where there's scope for compromise, and without, I've got like 2 minutes to sort out what's a really complex deal for the committee today. But just take the fisheries very briefly, where you've got for those who follow the technicalities of this, the EU side saying we want the certainty of relative stability in the technical term for our fishermen to know what access to UK waters they're going to have and what opportunities to fish in the UK. The UK said no. We want to go to something that works more like the EU-Norway negotiations, where what we do is we negotiate from zonal attachments. So we look at where the fish are, and we decide then how the total allowable catches might be divided up on the back of that. And that would not give the certainty that the EU is looking for its fishermen. So where's the compromise in that? Well, clearly you could see a compromise where the UK is saying, okay, fine, we will accept that your boats need some certainty year on year about what fishing opportunities there will be in waters. But we will, by the same token, we would expect that to reduce as a proportion of the catch over time. But that would be a long transition in order not to disadvantage your fishermen overly much as we go through this process. So classic sort of compromise, and you could see the possibilities there. On a level playing field, the UK government has made very clear that it is not going to lower standards on environmental protections or on the labour market. Bigger arguments around state aid, where the EU side is also demanding something which the UK government is saying unacceptable, which is so-called dynamic alignment on state aid, where the UK would have to continue to adjust to changes in the EU rulebook. Where would the compromise lie there? And if we were to sort of sit down and try to sort of thrash out a deal on that, it seems to me that the shape of that deal is pretty self-evident. On the one hand, the UK is saying we will sign up to binding so-called non-regression clauses. We will not let our standards slip, and we will not change our rules on state aid to weaken them from where they are at the moment. From the EU side, so fine, we accept that, and we will therefore drop our demand for the so-called dynamic alignment. We accept that you don't have to follow future changes in EU rules. So that's the space, it seems to me, where a solution could be found. But I come back to it, to find that space, to explore it, to open it up, to debate it, will require the political will on both sides to give the negotiators that space. Obviously, the negotiations happening as we speak. The last two rounds haven't been very promising, not hugely surprising actually at this stage in the negotiation. I doubt we'll see a lot of progress this week, but that's the sort of debate that needs to be started pretty soon in the summer if we're to get a chance to get this deal sorted by the year end.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Patrick Harvey to ask us questions.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Rycroft. I have to say I wasn't expecting this session to fill me with boundless confidence and optimism, and I haven't been surprised so far. I wonder if we could turn to the internal dynamics within the nations of the UK rather than the UK-EU relationship. You're obviously, as you said in your introduction, someone with a great deal of experience of the different governments within these islands. And in the absence of any formal constitutional mechanism to give the nations of the UK the ability to approve or withhold approval of any agreement, the process is now just down to the politics. I wonder if you've had a chance to look at Mr. Russell's statement to Parliament yesterday, Mike Russell's statement to Parliament. He said that the legal texts of the agreement, which were made available to the EU nations 2 weeks ago, we, the Scottish Government, had virtually no involvement in producing them and saw the legal texts with no possibility of changing them only 24 hours before they were published. He said the JMC, the Joint Ministerial Committee, is meant to have oversight of negotiations insofar as they affect devolved competence and to seek to agree the UK position. In fact, it's only met once. And he said, despite our efforts, the whole process is not about influencing what is happening and still less about deciding on crucial issues for which we are responsible. It is merely about hearing about what is happening. Mr. Rycroft, I wonder if you could tell us from your experience, is that a fair reflection of the general nature of the relationship between the governments on these matters? Is the mechanism that exists, such as it is for joint decision making, meaningful at all, or is it merely a cursory gesture?
A very, very fair question. I saw the letter that Mr. Russell wrote to your committee, and clearly we're very exposed to this debate over the time that I was in government, and really started off in June 2016 and hasn't stopped since then. Just two sort of introductory remarks, if I may. Firstly, of course, there is a huge chasm at the political level between what the Scottish Government believes is the right course for Scotland and, by extension, for the UK. Scotland obviously didn't vote to leave the EU. The Scottish Government itself not wishing to leave the EU and wanting a very different sort of outcome to our future relationship than the one that is proposed by the UK government. So that has been the hallmark, if you like, of the discussions ever since June 2016. Very little coincidence of political thinking over the big issues of our future relationship with the EU. There has, however, been, and it is just worth stating, because credit where credit's due to both governments, there has been a requirement for a lot of work a little bit beneath the surface in order to ensure that the UK is, as a whole, is ready for exit. So civil servants on both sides, with the support, obviously, of ministers, have done a lot of work to ensure around no deal planning, for example, around the statute book, to ensure the statute book, both UK and in Scotland, is competent for what happens once we've left the EU, and indeed around the new arrangements that will apply around the so-called common frameworks, where powers returning from Brussels that sit within devolved competence, where there will be, again in the sort of jargon, a far more extensive range of shared powers, which will require discussion between the four governments of the United Kingdom from here on into the foreseeable future. So just to put a marker down, there has been a little bit below the sort of political line of sight, a lot of hard work done on behalf of essentially the citizens of the whole of the UK to try and make sure that this is an orderly process. However, clearly one of the big criticisms that the Scottish Government has levelled at the UK Government, and this was true in my day as well as now, is that the engagement in the negotiating process has been very limited. We set up the JMCEN with the remit that you've just read out there in terms of oversight of the negotiations, seeking to reach agreement. And I think it's probably fair to say that that has not operated entirely to the satisfaction of all of those around that table. This is a choice of the UK government. The extent to which it seeks to involve the devolved governments in its deliberations. I've always been of the view that if it is politically possible, it would be better in terms of the UK's negotiating position if that clearly was a united one across, not just in terms of the other governments of the UK, but also supported by the business community and so on. But in the current political context, and given the difference of view between the Scottish government on the one hand and the UK government on the other, on what that future relationship would look like, it seems to me very, very difficult to see the circumstance in which there would be productive behind-the-scenes discussions about that UK negotiating position. And of course, formally, in constitutional terms, as you point out, Mr. Harvey, that is the position. This is reserved territory, and the devolved governments of the UK do not have the ability to formally approve or disapprove of the UK's negotiating position, or indeed the outcome of the negotiations.
Well, certainly the conducting of the negotiations is reserved territory, but very clearly a lot of the contents of what's agreed will impact on devolved territory. I'm also a member of the Finance and Constitution Committee, and its work on common frameworks hasn't led me to have any confidence that there will be limits on the imposition of frameworks where there is disagreement. Where there is disagreement, it seems to me that we're likely to have frameworks imposed rather than developed in common. I wonder if you could just say, though, if we accept that Mike Russell wasn't misleading the Chamber yesterday and that his description is accurate, that Scotland, the Scottish Government and the other administrations have had no meaningful input into shared decision making, if we accept that, from your experience not only of the structures but of the individuals involved at UK government level, do you see any prospect of a change, or are we simply going to have to accept that the UK government's attitude will be, they're not in our party, they're not Brexiteers, we're going to ignore their input?
It's a slightly difficult question. There's a bit different dimensions of that question, because ultimately the UK government has a responsibility for all the people of the UK. Where it's operating in reserved areas, if we again just follow the sort of constitutional route, then it absolutely needs to be developing its negotiating in a way that respects, understands and respects the interests of people across the UK. Now, clearly it will make up its mind how it responds to the political expression of those views. But if we come back to one of the big issues at stake here, fisheries, my view, it ought to be listening to what the Scottish Government has to say about that, but it also needs to be able to form its own view of the interests of the fishing community in Scotland in order to inform the approach it takes to those negotiations. There are constructs within the UK government, clearly, that allow ministers to tap into that sort of knowledge, to understand what's going on. That was part of my job, was to ensure that ministers around the cabinet table in Whitehall were clear about the interests of Scotland, and in my case, Scotland and Wales, and my colleagues in Northern Ireland Office for Northern Ireland as well. And there are the structures in place in Whitehall to achieve that, and I would not want to diminish the contribution of colleagues in the Scotland Office, for example, and my old team, and in other departments, for bringing that sort of understanding to UK ministers. But you have to layer over that then the politics of as you've described it, At what point does the UK government say, right, well, we understand where all this is coming from, but we have a different political view, Scottish government, and therefore we're not going to take account of the views of the Scottish government, but we are, if you like, interpreting the interests of Scotland in our own light.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr. Rycroft. I'd like to take you back actually to where we started this morning, talking about capacity issues, and we've already discussed how some senior Conservatives have said that handling Brexit negotiations at the same time as dealing with COVID won't be an issue. And Jackson Carlaw told Willie Rennie that the UK government can do two things at once. But it's difficult to understand how work on leaving the EU and managing COVID can continue without affecting each other. So as someone with the wealth of experience that you have, what's actually needed to handle these kind of discussions? And do you think this is the case?
There's absolutely no doubt at all coronavirus has a huge impact. The impact on the negotiation, practical one, in the sense that negotiations happening remotely, it is more difficult to advance them swiftly. The negotiating team in Whitehall has remained in place. It's now based in Number 10. It's not a huge team, and my understanding is that that has remained resourced up in order to continue the conduct of the negotiations on a sort of hub and spoke model, so the teams in departments supporting that are still there. The bigger impact, I think, has been on the preparations for the world that we will be moving into. And there's a lot of folk force who've been taken off that work in order to support the effort on coronavirus. I've no doubt that if coronavirus hadn't happened, that the UK government right now, for example, would be running a very big campaign, as it did last year, to engage businesses, to encourage and join them to take forward their own planning for what is going to pertain at the end of this year. That, assuming no extension of transition, as I said earlier on, we know we are going to have a trade border. For goods, that will mean in either deal or no deal, that goods transiting that border both ways will have to have customs declarations, security declarations. They'll have to go through the rules of origin process to prove where the goods have come from. They'll have to go through the regulatory procedures to ensure that those goods are capable of being marketed either in the UK or in the EU. And these are the so-called non-tariff barriers, which will apply at the end of this year, come what may, if we don't get an extension of the transition. If we're in a no deal and no trade deal context, add to that the potential for tariff barriers as well, which would be an additional burden for business. But actually, you look at the numbers, the non-tariff barriers are more significant. And this is where tens of thousands of businesses will need to adjust their processes and systems to get ready for that. So my worry about capacity is not so much actually about the negotiation. It's always handled by a relatively small team in the Whitehall context, likewise in the Commission. It is about the wider effort to support businesses to get ready and to make sure that the systems, the UK government systems, for running that new border in particular and all the processes associated with that are fit for purpose and ready to be up and running. If you just take, for one brief example, on IT systems, there's a plethora of new IT systems that have been built or are being built to manage that new border. But coronavirus has called on a huge way the IT capability in government to do some, and it's been done, some brilliant stuff has been done, for example, setting up the furlough scheme, dealing with this huge influx onto universal credit claimants and so on. There's a lot of work has been put in to make the big IT systems stand up to cope with this coronavirus. Been done very well, but inevitably that will have drawn folk off the continued preparation of IT systems necessary for our new trade relationship with the EU at the end of the year. So that's where my concerns lie. It's about readiness, and particularly the support that government gives to businesses to make sure that they're ready.
Yeah, and especially when they're dealing with such a cataclysmic catastrophe that COVID is to businesses. So can I sort of change tack a wee bit and ask you a little bit about citizens' rights in terms of whether you think the deadline for the settlement scheme should be extended to take account of COVID-19. We know that the lockdown has meant sort of the closure of scheme support centres and scanning centres and making it more difficult for EU nationals to apply to make their applications. And we know how valuable the EU citizens are to our society. So I just wondered if you had a view on that.
Yeah, to be honest, I haven't seen the latest stats on that. In terms of the numbers coming through the system, sort of pre-coronavirus, where we'd got to, I know the numbers were looking pretty good in terms of the throughput, but clearly, almost by definition, that there's going to be those who haven't yet sorted it out are more likely to be folk who've got questions, issues, and so on, which will need more sorting out. And I think there is the government's going to have to take a judgment call on that. And if it looks as though a backlog is built up which can't be cleared in time, then my view, but hey, I'm just a sort of a private citizen now, so I have no influence over what the government thinks. Then clearly the government, it would be, in my view, wise of the government to take a sympathetic approach to that, because as you say, the EU citizens that have chosen to live and work in the UK add huge value to our economy, culture, socially, and all the rest of it. So it would be very short-sighted, I think, of the government to not to allow some flexibility in the scheme if it looked as though coronavirus had inhibited people's ability to sort out their paperwork.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, colleagues, and thank you, Mr. Rycroft, for coming in to be questioned by us. Returning to the issue of where we are substantively with negotiations, there does seem to be a suggestion that it's not anything new for today, that if a deal were possible, it would involve a trade-off once again of the Scottish fishing interests, which we know is not a new thing. In fact, that happened on our way into the EU under Ted Heath's Tory government. In exchange for the EU, you seem to suggest having some room for manoeuvre on the level playing field issue. But with regard to that, I just wonder to what extent they do have a lot of wiggle room as a matter of EU law on that, because, of course, the coherence of the single market, which is predicated on the 4 fundamental treaty freedoms, it is something that really is kind of immutable without unravelling the whole thing. And I'm not entirely sure all member states would be entirely signed up for that. So I just don't exactly see where the wiggle room comes to any meaningful degree. And also, of course, while state aid has been mentioned, it appears that in the UK's papers published, I think on the 18th of May or thereabouts, there's been no mention of public procurement. So I'm just not really following what room the EU actually has, even if it got a deal, a trade-off on fish. I mean, not all member states have a huge interest in fish, but they do have an interest in fair competition.
Yeah, I just to take the fish point first. Of course, the people's understanding of what happened in the early 70s, a sort of trade-off between that sort of relatively generous access to UK waters was offered at that point as part of the overall deal. It's just worth remembering, of course, that the the boats from what are now EU member states have been fishing in UK waters for decades prior to our entry into the EU. There's a very long historic tradition pre the establishment of the 200-mile limit and so on. I suspect this time, because fisheries is so salient in this, and it's not just about the access to the waters, there's also the issue of trade. A lot of UK fish sold into the EU and vice versa. So I suspect, but I may be proved wrong on this, that the fisheries is such a dominant issue in this negotiation, it will have to be settled on its own terms. I can't see there being a direct trade-off, for example, between fisheries and financial service. I think that's stretching things a little bit too far. I'd say I think that probably will be the case in terms of fisheries being settled on its own terms. Have to wait and see. In terms of the level playing field, it has been clear from the word go that the major concern of the EU in its future relationship with the UK has been about fair competition in the broadest sense of those words. And that has been clear from the off. The UK is a very major trading partner with the EU. It's on the EU's doorstep, and the EU has member states have worried from the off about the terms of trade with you, hence the emphasis on the level playing field issues. Now, I don't think there is any inhibition in terms of EU law that would stop the EU coming to a deal with the UK on level playing field issues. If the political will is there, as I said earlier on, I think a compromise is possible. The four freedoms no longer apply. We have left the single market as we've left the EU. So the level playing field argument has to play out about the nature of the relationship between the EU on the one hand as a trading entity and the UK on the other as a trading entity. There are level playing field conditions in most free trade agreements. What the EU is looking for is for a more advanced version of that than the UK is currently offering. Essentially, the UK is offering something akin to what is in the Canada-EU agreement. The EU is saying, no, we want something far more advanced from that, and indeed including this pitch for dynamic alignment on state aid. Seems to me there is room for both sides to meet somewhere in the middle, but that relies on the UK saying we're not going to drop our standards, and for the EU to accept that as sufficient to meet their concerns about fair competition between the UK and the EU. Just one other point on all of this. I think there is, in some of the commentary on this, a sort of sense that the EU is being unreasonable in the demands that it set. And there's almost sort of petulance in some of the commentary. The EU is making, what right has it got to make these sorts of demands? Well, of course, the EU has every right to make whatever demands it wishes to make in a negotiation with what is now a third country, just as the US has or Japan has. That is the world of trade negotiations. The EU is now setting out its conditions in the interests of the EU and the 27 member states, just as the UK is setting out its conditions in the interests of the UK. And while we may not like what they're saying, we can't complain about the fact that that's the position they've reached. They are in sovereign entity, and they have, they will reach what they think is a reasonable position to look after the interests of the 27. And I think it's the realization is dawning perhaps a little bit too slowly in the UK that we are now a third country. And the EU does not negotiate in the interests of third countries, it negotiates in its own interests.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, I'm back. I totally agree with that last point. It seems to me, and I had worked as a lawyer in Brussels specialising in EU law for 10 years, that the UK wants to remain in the club without abiding by the rules. And that seems to be the kind of sticking plaster. I mean, just one other comment on fish. Of course, it was under the 30-year rule that we saw that in Whitehall expressly stated that the Scottish fishing interest was expendable in the negotiations to take us into the EU as a matter of historical record. Turning to another issue in my second and last question, if I may, and it's the issue of preparedness for no deal. And given your experience at the heart of the UK government at the time, I mean, I just wonder, when did the preparations for no deal start? And, you know, have they continued apace continuously? Or have they stopped and started? And are they currently going on? And what is the capacity of, in terms of human resource, in terms of the civil service to progress that, okay, preparedness for no deal whilst negotiating with the EU, whilst dealing with COVID-19 and whilst trying to get on with the rest of the business of government? It would be interesting to hear your view, having been at the heart of the UK government on these matters.
I can speak with some confidence about no deal planning up to the end of March 2019 because I was responsible for the coordination of it. And that work did start very early, but it was work. We weren't just planning for no deal; we were planning for exit with a deal as well, because there actually is a measure of coincidence between the work that needs to be done. It's not absolutely clear the big issues that would arise. But we, from the DExEU perspective, coordinated that work across departments, and that work clearly ramped up through 2018. We established the Yellowhammer mechanism, which was not about dealing with no deal in its totality. That was set up to sort out issues that would emerge where the no deal planning basically hadn't delivered the outcomes that we wanted. So just one very brief example of that, the no deal planning anticipating the need to handle the border in a different way, to have different infrastructure, to have different instructions to hauliers and so on and so forth. And that was the plan. If that plan broke down and there was subsequent queues at the border, Yellowhammer kicked in to deal with those concerns. So Yellowhammer was a subset of the overall planning for no deal. And we put huge resource onto it, no doubt about it. It was a big part of the departments I had the privilege of leading was working on that, and became the central preoccupation of a number of other government departments as well. And we mobilised staff from departments who weren't Brexit impacted to come on to that work too. Now that work, as far as I know, carried on at some pace through 2019. What I can't speak for is where that's got to now. I'm not in the system anymore. But as I said in response to an earlier question, my concern is that because of the impact of coronavirus, and as you rightly point out, that has had a huge demand for extra resources because of that, that will have drawn resource off the continued work on preparedness, both not just for no deal, but for a deal outcome as well. And that is something which I'm sure the government is very conscious of. But there is a lot of work to do between now and the end of the year to ensure that the new trade border and other arrangements function effectively.
Thank you. We shall see.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Rycroft. Mr. Rycroft, earlier in your comments, you spoke about the economic impact assessment that was published in November 2018. And obviously the economic landscape has changed hugely since that period of time. We're aware that the UK draft legal texts, that they weren't accompanied by an economic or indeed an equalities impact assessment. So there is very little way of telling how the UK's proposals would actually affect the UK economy, which clearly, as we know, is severely damaged so far by COVID-19. Are you aware of any updated UK government economic impact assessment through the COVID period and any forecasts going forward?
The simple answer is no, and no reason why I would be privy to anything that wasn't in the public domain. I made the point earlier on that the modelling that was done by the UK government that was published in 2018 was consistent with a lot of the other modelling done by other groups of economists, and I stand by that. And while of course it doesn't, there is nothing that's been updated to reflect the nuances of the UK's negotiating position as now set out in that draft legal text. I think the broad parameters of the likely economic impact remain as they were. The UK government's position has not shifted so dramatically off what we modelled as an average FTA, and I think to obviate the work that was done. So I would stand by that sort of range of estimates that were put in place then as a pretty good indicator of the likely economic impact over time. This is modelling, and to anticipate critics of what I've just said, of course, modelling is not deterministic. It is setting out what might happen, all other things being equal. And of course, governments have the capacity to anticipate problems, to make changes in order to try and smooth off some of those potentially bad impacts. One of those, and it's probably just worth mentioning briefly in the bygoing, is of course if we're losing traction in our trade relationship with the EU, you generate new opportunities through free trade agreements with the rest of the world. But you'll have seen that there is modelling done for the US deal and for the Japan deal that would look topside for the US deal. It's about 0.16% uplift in GDP. For Japan, to memory, it's about 0.07% uplift in UK GDP if those negotiations are successful. That plays the downside risk of averaged FTA in terms of our future relationship with the EU of a loss of growth of around 5%. So that's the, as far as one can get a handle on the relative economic impact of these things. Those are the stats that have been modelled on a similar basis, put in the public domain by the government, and I think are still valid.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, that was interesting that you brought the US in to the debate, because obviously, as we're aware, that the UK government included public procurement into the draft legal text for the USA trade deal, but not the EU trade deal. So it'd be interesting to hear your comments on that. But certainly, my main question is on the issue of the economy once again, particularly trade with the EU. But the Financial Times, obviously a newspaper that's traditionally been more supportive of the Conservative Party as compared to others. The Financial Times on the 20th of May, they, in their opinion piece, they wrote, the UK stated plan will see significant new regulatory burdens placed upon British exporters and importers. The decision not to enter a customs union and refusal to sign up to a legally enforceable common standards that will place new costs on UK businesses just when many are already fighting for survival because of coronavirus. And then yesterday, the Scottish Government published the case for extending the Brexit transition period and highlighted a number of areas in terms of the additional costs that are going to affect business, what tariffs there may or not be on trade with the EU, which regulations they should follow, what customs paperwork and processes will apply, how people and data will be able to cross borders in order to make businesses work, and also whether professional qualifications will be recognised. So, notwithstanding the fact that you still stand by the report of 2018, clearly there is now a growing body of opinion and also evidence that indicates that what was written in 2018 is now, it's past. It can no longer be considered to be valid and accurate in the current economic situation and post the 31st of December this year.
I think what of course it didn't accommodate at all, and of course it couldn't do, was the impact of coronavirus and what impact that has on macroeconomic conditions. And there are huge uncertainties around all of that. Absolutely accept that. But the modelling that was done actually did incorporate the sort of figures that you're referring to, because those numbers, the impact, and I referred to earlier on, of non-tariff barriers, actually those numbers were established well before that work was completed, led by HMRC, and they estimated that the impact of customs declarations on their own, it's about 205 million extra customs declarations that will be required once we establish that new trade border with the EU, would add, from the UK side of the border alone, about 6.5 billion of cost. Probably similar coming from the other side. So add that up, that's 13 billion. You put on top of that the cost of doing things like rules of origin declarations and so on. And the estimated range of costs was between 17 and 20 billion pounds. Actually, the non-tariff barrier cost, that was really the heart of the modelling that was done, because that's what the economists are saying, that's what drives up costs to businesses. It's a cost to businesses, ultimately it's a cost to the consumer. So what the FT was saying, in a sense, wasn't news to me, because that has been clear right the way through this process. And I just make the point again, what the government is driving towards as a free trade agreement, if we get that deal, I think it remains in our interest to get a trade deal. But even if we get that deal, we will be trading on different terms and conditions in the EU than we are now. In a way, talking about as a free trade agreement gives a slightly false impression. It will be in the proper terminology of free trade agreement, the WTO rules and so on. But in practice, what it is, it's an agreement to have less free trade than we have now, because that is the reality. We're coming out of the biggest and most established free trade area that the modern world has ever seen, and we're going into a different trade relationship. The impact of that is to put that trade border in place for services as well as goods, and that puts costs on businesses that do not exist at the moment. And that is where these estimates were derived from. And as I say, of course, much has changed since then. Some parts of the UK negotiating position have shifted, but what I just stand by the fact what we're heading towards, if we get a deal, average free trade agreement, did incorporate all of the costs that the FT was describing in its opinion piece on the 20th of May.
Okay, would you like to comment on the America point?
On procurement, well, there's a comments on the US deal. I mean, there's a whole wealth of issues around all of that, clearly, some of which are hugely important from a devolved perspective, not least what sort of deal is done on agri-food. Lots of interesting issues about the trade-off between a US deal and an EU deal. And that's going to be one of the big interesting stories, I think, over the next few months. On the procurement piece, I wouldn't claim to be an expert on public procurement. The market for public procurement is clearly a big one globally. The UK has signed up to the general agreements on procurement through the WTO. But you can do better than that in different trade deals. So I don't know why the UK has not put in procurement as an objective on the EU side. But where that takes us in the negotiation, I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a little time left, as I indicated at the beginning, so if members want to come back in again, if they indicate to me by pressing R in the chat box. I'd like to start, Mr. Rycroft, by going back to when you sketched out what might look like a compromise over fishing, and you talked about how, for example, the UK could accept EU boats on their terms, so they give them certainty, but that would reduce gradually over a long transition period. You described it as a classic compromise. You might be aware that when Charles Grant came to this committee, he told us that he had actually been told by somebody within the UK government that that fishing would be the result of a compromise that would be sold out, basically, as Annabel Ewing had alluded to in the past. I just wondered that when you were sketching out that compromise, does that come from information that you're hearing from government, or was you purely speculating?
It comes out of there. So one of my jobs a long time ago when I worked for the Scottish Executive was to look after fishing, was a part of the team that looks after fishing. So I've had a long interest in fish, and this is me surmising. I do not have any inside track on that, but it is just worth saying. I mean, that might sound as selling out the fishing industry or not. There are multiple interests in the fishing industry. It's not just about the catch side. It is also, and the catch in pelagic and demersal fisheries, also about shell fisheries, the export of products, particularly from Scotland, into the EU market. And a good outcome does obviously protect the interests of the trawler boats for the pelagic and the demersal, but also sustains that really lucrative market for the shell fishermen in the northwest and elsewhere. All of us will have watched those boats being loaded up in Loch Inver to get onto the Spanish market over within the day, and that trade happening at the moment, obviously without tariffs, getting through without having to be stopped to be inspected and so on. The more we can do to keep those trade links open by a good overall deal on fisheries, the better for the whole of the fishing community, not just in Scotland, but the rest of the UK as well. But just to reassure you, I do not have an inside track on the UK's negotiated position on fisheries. But it is like a lot of these issues. There's a lot of political noise, a lot of smoke and dust. But when you step back from it, think about this over a 10, 15, 20-year period. Think about the economic and social and community interests of both sides. That you can see a shape of a deal, which requires compromise, so it'll be a bit uncomfortable for both sides, but far better to have that certainty for those who depend on this industry. They can see the road ahead, and they're not going to have a sudden shock of losing access or losing markets. That surely is a better outcome than heading into a no deal, which could be very disruptive of trade both ways. And of the stability overall of the industry.
Okay, we have questions from a number of members. Annabel Ewing, followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, convener. Yeah, obviously, certainly Scotland doesn't want no deal. That's a given. The other issue I had actually wanted to raise, which I realised I didn't, because I'd used my 2 questions elsewhere, was the important issue of judicial and police cooperation. And I just wonder, because this is hugely important, and I think it's not really received, certainly in the media, the attention that it deserves, because it impacts actually hugely on our personal safety and all the rest of it. But I just wonder to what extent there can be any meaningful cooperation without a role for the ECJ, which seems a stumbling block, and it'd be interesting to hear your views on that.
Yeah, that is a good question. You've got judicial and police cooperation, but that also the wider security cooperation, access to databases and so on, all developed in that wider construct of European law, but also on the acceptance that every member state that's part of those systems abides by the European Convention on Human Rights. That's the absolute foundation block for this. The confidence that if you're opening up your systems to access by other states, that you are confident that they will respect fundamental human rights in the way that that access is used. I agree with you. This is that the whole judicial, police, security cooperation is not as much discussed in the media and elsewhere as it should be. It is absolutely critical. There is clearly a big mutual interest in getting this right. If the UK, for example, can get access to some of these important databases on which cooperation on criminal matters, for example, depend, there's no economic advantage or disadvantage. It's not an economic issue. This is a security issue about the security of our citizens. And one would hope that both sides would recognise that. It may be that we can't get everything sorted out this year. It's one of those issues that may require continuing negotiation into next year. But not so much the ECJ as the ECHR, the EU will be looking for the assurance that the UK will remain committed to the rights enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights, because that's the assurance they need to give their citizens. Okay, we're sharing our data with what is now a third country, but we do so in the confidence that they will respect the use of that data. And I think that is the issue which, if you just see a little bit beneath the surface, is there as something which not yet resolved in order to allow that negotiation to advance.
Thank you very much. Claire.
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to ask about the status of the political declaration. When we had evidence last week from David McAllister, he did talk about it as being a legitimate document and the basis for negotiations, but it would appear that the UK government have pretty much abandoned it when you look at the free trade agreement proposal they're now pursuing. So do you think that is still a relevant document? And as a supplementary to that, you had, we know that the negotiations really have to be finalised by the end of October before ratification. Are you confident the 27 EU countries will ratify, or do you foresee any difficulties there in terms of ratification?
Yeah. So on the political declaration, it obviously wasn't a binding legal document. It did what it said. It was a joint declaration, subject of a lot of work over the months, adjusted at the insistence of the incoming Johnson government. It does, it seems to me, remain very relevant because it was a position that it was a declaration that both sides signed up to and was meant to be the foundation, set the foundations on which the negotiation could be built. And my hope would be that as the negotiation moves forward, that the UK government and the EU side as well recognise the value in that document of setting out a framework for the negotiation, which will help to arrive at a deal. And that includes on the one issue, and Senator, you're referring to, where it seems to be that the government may have departed from what was said in the political declaration around level playing field issues. But there are instances going the other way as well. So if we are to find that compromise, then the political declaration comes into its own again, because in that declaration, it seems to me, can be found the political intent which would allow that compromise to be found. In terms of ratification, in order to get this done by the end of the year, will require unanimity, to my understanding, in the Council. If it's deemed to be a mixed agreement, it will then require ratification by member states, but you can provisionally apply an agreement of this nature, a free trade agreement. That's been done in the past, so that you can get it in place and then ratification can take place over time. I think the nature of the deal that we're doing, or that we're seeking to do between the UK and the EU, I would not anticipate ratification difficulties from individual member states. But that's me anticipating something that is quite a way ahead, because we don't know what the shape of the final deal might look like. But if we're on a track, if we do get a deal, if the political will is there, the goodwill is there to get a deal, I'd be pretty confident that the ratification procedures can be completed that are necessary to have the deal kick in, even if only provisionally applied, for the beginning of next year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Just as a brief question regarding citizens' rights. The UK government have put forward the proposals, the suggestion to actually restrict EU migration into the UK after Brexit. And yesterday we have the Prime Minister with his completely ironic comments of saying to EU nationals to come back here to help the British economy. So you stated a few moments ago, Mr. Rycroft, regarding the issue of compromise. Do you think this is an area that the UK government should compromise on to actually help with the negotiations to move this agenda forward?
So there are people movement issues in the negotiations, but they sit within quite a specialist category, particularly around so-called Mode 4 provisions, which is about typical in free trade agreements, about movements of business people to service, business contracts, and so on. Immigration does not sit within these negotiations. The UK's policy on immigration, freedom of movement ends, and the UK is legislating to put in place a new system for immigration, which will encompass, obviously, all countries, now including post-freedom of movement, the EU as well. And so there's obviously huge debate about that, the conditionalities of that, salary caps, points-based system and so on. Are they right? Are they right for the UK as a whole? Are they right for different parts of the UK? But formally speaking, not part of the negotiation. There is, within all of that, however, a goodwill point. How open is the UK to migration from the EU is a matter of big concern to a number of EU states. So they will be looking really closely at what is now a domestic policy decision for the UK about how we handle our future immigration policy, and will draw their own conclusions from that. The point you make that the Prime Minister was recognising about the needs of the UK economy, clearly we still have a big reliance on migration from different parts of the world, including the EU, for all sorts of different industries and at different levels of skill. That's not going to change overnight. And as I think, again, as a lot of economists and others would recognise, it is important to the UK economy that we have a sensible system for immigration. But the way that we construct that also sends signals about the sort of country that we're seeking to be, not just to EU countries, actually, but to places like India and elsewhere in the world as well. So that bill, I think, one of the first post-Brexit major pieces of UK legislation, really important that gets good scrutiny from the business community, from civil society, from across the UK, really important for the future of this country.
And thank you very much for that answer. And that actually concludes our session with Mr. Rycroft today. Can I thank you very much, Philip, for coming along to speak to us. It's been extremely helpful. And the committee will be continuing our scrutiny of the negotiations next week, where we will have a panel of stakeholders giving us their views So the time of that meeting, if you hope to watch that online, will be confirmed as soon as possible. That concludes the public part of this morning's meeting, and we can now move into private session. Thank you again.